Hey guys, I am super excited. It is 4:30 in the morning and I am packing up my car and we're gonna head up to Boston. Why? Because I'm doing an F1 car, an actual F1 car. Now back when I did the McLaren Longtail out at Pebble Beach, I really thought long and hard about how I was gonna approach it, what I was gonna do. And I said, hey, if I ever get the opportunity to do an F1 car, I'm totally gonna do it. But it's crazy early in the morning right now, so that's why I'm whispering. Because I have a wife and child sleeping and I don't want to wake them up and I'm getting nervous that I'm going to do that because I'm too excited. But let's pack everything up, let's head up there, and we're going to detail today an F1 car on Drive and Protect. I'm so excited. After a 3.5-hour soggy trip to Norwell, Massachusetts, we arrived at McLaren Boston and met up with my longtime friend, Billy Richmond, head of service and parts. This dealership is a candy store for all things exotic, and after my quick tour of the showroom, Billy took us back to a secret room behind the service area to get a glimpse of the owner's latest acquisition. This is a 2004 McLaren MP4-19B with the last of the great 3-liter V10s with over 900 horsepower and driven by David Coulthard. So like all this grass and
that is authentic. This car was raced, put away, and then sat in the garage until now. So everything you see is from the 2004 season.
That's definitely wrong.
This model year was considered to be the golden era for Formula One due to the incredible sound and power these engines produced. Now, being a McLaren Mercedes, the livery is the classic silver arrow, but it can use a healthy polish due to the swirls and love marks from constant trackside wipe-downs. However, the trick today is navigating these notoriously thin paints while still removing the swirls without burning through the livery. As a retired race car, it'll spend most of its life on display at the dealership or in the owner's living room, so one final but very careful polish is well worth the effort. Likewise, at the end of the video, we'll chat with Colin Ashlaw, an automotive master technician for Aston Martin, Lotus Motorsports, and McLaren, as well as an F1 historian to better understand what makes this particular car so special. But first, we needed a bit of working space for the detail, which required the Sennas to be put in the corner of the garage. These two McLarens are named after the Brazilian Ayrton Senna, honoring his success as a McLaren Formula One driver. The Sennas themselves are largely based on the McLaren 720S platform, with a modified version of the carbon fiber monocoque and tweaked twin-turbo V8 producing 789 horsepower, pushing the car from 0 to 62 in 2.8 seconds and a top speed of 211 miles an hour, with a starting price of about $1 million. Now, with the F1 on GoJacks, we easily pushed it sideways in the garage to start our paint assessment. This weekend, the McLaren dealership is having a big event in honor of the new acquisition, so the owner wants it to look perfect.
Okay, at this point, step number one, of course, is to clean the paint. Clearly, it's an open cockpit F1 car, so it's not exactly, two buckets and power washing, that kind of thing will ruin the car. So I'm using a bit of frothy here, just lifting up the dirt in all the tight spots. And then once we're done there, we'll be able to see what's really going on in the paint. And just from looking at it from this angle, I'm not sure if you can see it on camera, there's a lot of deep scratches over here. I'm guessing, the driver getting into the car. And there's some cracks here and there because the material itself is very thin. So thinking, while I'm doing this, I'm like, hey, how am I going to approach it? I think we're going to do a lot by hand first. Again, it is extremely thin. I can see very, very thin areas where they just kind of sprayed the paint, just barely enough paint to put the symbols and the livery and all that kind of stuff on there for the sponsors. So this is going to be a bit of an intense, slow, sort of like digging a hole with a spoon. Just barely touching the paint to kind of remove as much as I can, sort of in this preservation mindset to kind of bring it back for this weekend.
With that, Dan and I frothied the paint and used compressed air for the tight spots that held tons of trackside pebbles and grass. While we were hoseless washing the intricate suspension and aero, I noticed what looked like gold tin foilish sheets wrapped around both rear suspension wishbones. This is done to protect the carbon fiber from the intense engine and exhaust heat. The thin gold foil is used because it's malleable and is an incredibly efficient heat insulator. It can be found on most race cars that encounter extreme temperature requirements during use. Once the dust and dirt is removed, it's obvious the paint has heavy swirls and a lackluster appearance, which can be expected on a driven race car. Normally, this is easy enough to remove on any street car, but absolutely terrifying to do on an F1 race car that can't be measured with common paint depth gauges. So first is a hand test spot to get a feel for just how thin the paint is.
All right, when I'm doing a test panel on a car that has very thin or finicky paint, the first thing I like to do is use something like this, which is a microfiber pad. In particular, it's white. So if something were to go wrong as I'm wiping it and as I'm rubbing the paint, I can quickly look up and say, ooh, wait a second, did I blow through it? Or, the pad itself is very soft, so it's kind of like, the analogy I like to use is sort of archaeology. If you're trying to, uncover this dinosaur or whatever, you basically just kind of brush it real quick, step back, oh, is everything okay? Reassess, and then go back in, maybe brush a little bit more, and brush a little bit more. So this would be the first kind of wipe, let's say, of something so sensitive that you don't want to ruin anything. And I'm kind of just barely rubbing it right now using one of my special concoctions here of a compound that's got a bit of lubrication in it, making sure, look, there's nothing coming off. I'll come in real quick, wipe, I'll use my light and sort of reassess, and right off the bat, just a little bit of that back and forth with this compound is showing improvement. So I'll slowly move on, and if I can go stronger and stronger, meaning if I can use a tool or a machine, I'll gladly do it because there are some flat spaces here. But overall, I think most of this will be done by hand. But as we're moving, I guess the point of the story is just start slowly, and you can use something like a pad like this and then move up to machines if possible.
After our various tests and a 50-50 spot with a microfiber pad and compound by hand, I felt enough confidence in the strength of the paint at this point to move to machines, foam pads, and a light polish to accomplish the preservation in less time and without excessive hand and shoulder fatigue. With the test spots done and the plan of attack set, Dan and I laid out all the tools and sizes based on the extremely tight spots and narrow openings found on this particular vehicle. To efficiently work on race cars or voluptuous supercars with lots of tight spots, you need to be aware of two major factors: the size of the pad and the size of the machine's stroke. For this project, we're using 3-inch orbitals with a 12mm throw, all the way down to a 1/4-inch pad with no throw, otherwise known as a rotary, and everything in between. The width, depth, and location of the area you're polishing dictates the type of tool and pad most suited for the job. Here's a good example. These are the air scoops on either side of the cockpit. They're deep, narrow, and skinny. Obviously, any common machine with a large throw wouldn't work in these tight spots because it would bang against the sides. It's what we call karate chopping an edge. Instead, I used a 1-inch rotary and extension with no throw or side-to-side movement, so I can polish right up to the edge of the scoop without banging into the sides and damaging it. However, on the large spaces, we used a 3-inch machine with a 12mm stroke or a side-to-side action because the paint's landscape would allow it. Typically, the larger the throw, the more work or paint correction is being done in a given area. In other words, it can be more efficient to use a larger stroke machine when it's not confined in a tight spot. For more nerdy information on this specific point, click the link above to check out the differences between the rotary, large stroke, and forced rotation machines in the Ammo Training Academy 204 series, where we put the machines on a piece of glass with LEDs attached to see each pad's unique orbit. To consistently clean our pads and capture the residue, we soaked a 5-gallon bucket with water and pointed the compressed air and pad towards the bottom of the bucket so that the dust would get stuck to the water and not fly around the room, keeping all the cars in the room clean. The irony is here, there isn't actually a whole lot of paint to polish on an F1 car, but getting access and reaching to those areas was by far the trickiest I've ever worked on in my career, especially because it's so low to the ground and delicate. I also found multiple places on the paint with what seemed to be overspray. This one in particular is at the very highest point of the car on top of the air scoop. Do you see the mark right there? After closer inspection, these marks were in the paint and not on top of the paint, so claying was not effective here. It required a polish to be removed. So to keep the repair as focused as possible, again, I used a 1-inch rotary and my polish to ensure the area would stay as cool as possible on this very thin and flexible material. After polishing for a few hours with 1, 2, and 3-inch pads, which sort of feels like shoveling a snow-covered driveway with a spoon, we managed to restore the paint and remove all the swirls without any issues. Next, we focused on the bolts, screws, and other locking hardware. To polish them, we cut a 1-inch pad down to a 1/4-inch pad and did the same thing for the backing plate so that it would fit in or on top of the screw head and bring back its original luster. I also asked the owner if I should clean the leather headrest, as a few helmet scuffs could be seen from previous racing. With the okay given, I applied lather and scrubbed with an interior brush, then quickly dried with a microfiber towel to remove the blemishes. Now, at this point in the project, the owner of the car stopped by for a visit to look at his baby and check out the before and after of the paint in particular. His mission was to have us preserve the exterior so that he could put it on display at various shows for others to enjoy and admire as he does. Now, he's a pretty cool, laid-back guy, but he did dare me to try to squeeze into the cockpit, and I couldn't turn down my chance to sit in a real F1 race car, or at the very least try to wedge myself in. First, the collar is removed and the steering wheel is unzip-tied. Now, it's zip-tied to ensure that it doesn't, disappear, as an F1 steering wheel can cost up to $50,000 to $60,000 to replace. Once off, I jimmied my way into, or should I say, onto the seat. Now, F1 cockpits are not normal seats, and that's pretty obvious, but what isn't obvious to me is that these guys are basically laying down in the car, where your feet are higher than your butt.
No human being can fit in that, right? I'm about as skinny as it gets, and it's half the size of my...
Your head is blocking the
So, with me being all legs, my butt couldn't get low enough to fit into David's non-existent waist-size seat because my legs were too long, pushing my body further back and out of the seat. Anyways, while everyone was enjoying my struggles and suggesting my head should be sucked into the intake, I was off on a racetrack in my mind, playing with the fuel buttons and wondering what 6Gs actually feels like. And afterwards, I cleaned the steering wheel on the workbench to get a better feel for all the buttons and spend 5 more minutes with something I've always wanted to see and hold up close. Once playtime was over, Dan and I preserved the paint with 2 coats of ammo skin and 1 coat of gelée on the wheels. Afterwards, we applied a very light layer of cream for a natural glow before spending 2 hours inspecting the finished product for leftover compound, polish, sealant, or wax. To do this, we used several detailing brushes and picks to get into the bolts and other hardware that collected polishing residue. Now, the most important yet most overlooked aspect of any detailing, washing, or cleaning is the final inspection. People who gravitate towards detailing and appreciate the subtlety tend to focus on the one thing that's wrong with the job instead of the 1,000 things that went right. Like it or not, that's just a fact of our industry, which is why most Concord judges write down or critique what's missing, dirty, or imperfect on a car, not what's done right. In light of that, the final inspection can get you 1% closer to that elusive and unobtainable perfect detail, so don't skip the step. Once we were all done, the car was moved into the main service department prior to the arrival of Colin Ashlaw, so we could better understand the historical significance and how the technology exercised on these earlier race cars has found its way onto modern street-legal supercars of today.
This car is special because this is really getting towards the last of the great V10 era cars. V10 era started in 1995. Placing this in 2004, 2003 was the first year Formula One cars really breached handily 900 horsepower and over 19,000 RPM with a 3-liter V10. We're looking at performance values of around above 300 horsepower per liter. These were monumentally fast cars. Another significant point is the weight of the paint. This is a good example of how you can use weight to your advantage. This is a carbon fiber body. All of this carbon fiber is naturally the color black. So if you're using black or darker colors, which McLaren was, they can actually save on coats of paint. Likely all of these cars, like any race car, is going to be on the brink of the weight limit no matter what you do, and you can use ballast to adjust for it, but this is a good example of what you would do if you're going to use carbon fiber to your advantage with your color scheme. A lot of people tend to look at Formula One as this is the best that it can be. This is the best of aerodynamics. This is the best of chassis technology. The reality is, the formula is the rule book. So if you're racing in a formula, you have to abide by the restrictions of those rules. So this wing, this design shape, everything that you see here is the best that this particular team could do, the best of their ideas within that formula. Road cars are not restricted. You don't have to conform, you have to conform to safety regulations, but if you're in a modern supercar, the aerodynamics are the limit of your creativity. You use the lessons that you learned from racing, which is restricted, and apply it in a meaningful way with a road car. This is a really good example of what a modern supercar, a modern McLaren is like on the underside. This is part that really you don't see too often. You'll notice how flat the underbody is. It leads up to this point where you have this distinct fencing. That answers one of the problems that a lot of people often answer. Well, what about when you're going around a corner? How do you still have downforce? Well, this keeps rigid columns of air channeled, so you still maintain that pressure gradient, and you still have downforce while you're either cornering or in motion. That's one of the keys, highlights to this technology. That would be directly taken from Formula One racing. If you look here, this was an era where exhaust flow and how it reacts with the rear wing and the back of the car is critical. That hasn't gone away. You have an aggressive flow coming out of this area, and you'll notice how everything here is formed and shaped, because everything from the front of the car to the side pods over the intake is channeling this rear wing. That's the entire point, to feed that airflow and then make it clean at the back end. The worst thing you can do is create drag. All of these aerodynamics are great unless they hold you back. And if airflow isn't connecting into a streamline at the end, then you're really creating a counterintuitive scenario. And if you look at, for instance, the back of a McLaren, you'll see the exhaust placement is that so that it connects with that airflow. The rear wing, the exhaust, the diffuser, they all have to work together. There's no magic bullet. There's no single component.
Well, we did it, an F1 car. I am so excited. It's sort of a white whale bucket list thing for me. I know we did the McLaren GTR at Pebble Beach, and that was a dream come true. And I thought, hey, if we could do an F1 car that is a McLaren, that is like the ultimate. So I finally did it, and I am so excited. So one of the things that I've learned here is I chatted with the owner of the vehicle, and he said, hey, when I got the car, this was the and is the only F1 McLaren in the United States. In fact, they only released 5 of them altogether from the factory. So this is a very special and extremely rare car. From a detailing angle, when I first got here or I was driving up, I'm like, I'm probably gonna have to do this by hand because there's no paint with the speed and the weight, that whole thing. When I started working it, we could get it by hand, no problem. But I said, you know what? It's really strong. This paint's solid. Why don't we boost it up a little bit and use a little bit more aggressive behavior? Meaning instead of hand, we're going to go with a machine, use some polish and a foam pad, which on the street, in the real world with a normal car, that's wildly safe, right? On this one, I was getting a little bit nervous, but it turned out absolutely perfect. So we could speed up and do bigger sections with the machine. So I was pretty pleased with that. Overall, I am really excited. The car looks spectacular. The owner is thrilled. This is going to be on display, like I said earlier, and I think people are going to freak out just as much as I did. So as always, I want to thank Colin and Dan for helping me out on the detail, but this has been a big moment in my career. So thanks for watching, and I hope you guys enjoy.